Guatemala versus Costa Rica. Which one should you visit next? So if you're planning a trip to Central America, you're probably wondering which country is the safest, which one has the most to offer, logistics, what to visit, all kinds of questions. And I have been to both Guatemala and Costa Rica, and I want to give you some tips on how to plan your holiday. In March 2024, I visited Guatemala and Costa Rica, which are two of the most popular destinations in Central America. But before choosing to visit these countries, I've spent days researching the best countries and places to visit in Central America. I then proceeded to watch many YouTube videos because there's very little information available in English online from travelers like I am about how it's like to visit on your own these countries in Central America. It seemed to me that Central America is a gray part of tourism because many of the questions that I found online were about, is it safe, how expensive it is, and most of these weren't really answered by blogs and videos online. Therefore, I decided to make this video. Now, as a disclaimer, my last video, which was about traveling in San Jose, the capital of Costa Rica, generated bullying comments to my personal status as traveler, and I just want to say this: bullying is not something we should be encouraged to do or accept in our lives. And this channel, including this video, is something I do out of passion. It includes just my personal experience, views, and recommendations. And if you do not agree with something that I said, maybe it was wrong, then I will happily read your comments if you give me your arguments. But if you're just here to troll on my account and give me negative and nasty comments, then this isn't about tourism or traveling. This is about being not a nice person. And with that being said, what's the best time to visit? So first of all, from my understanding, again, I might be wrong with my facts, but I'm just gonna share with you my own personal experience. I visited Central America in March, and that is the high season because it's the dry season, so basically it doesn't rain as much. But there are two main seasons, the dry and the wet season. In one it rains and in one it doesn't, so it's basically better to visit when it does not rain because you can spend more time outside, and most of the attractions are basically outside in the nature. It never gets really cold like it does in Europe, for instance, so basically you can visit Central America all year long. It's just a matter of budget because prices can be higher in the high season. It also depends on the location, the city, the place, a lot of stuff. And also, if you decide to go there to attend a specific event, it could be more expensive during that time. So for instance, in March 2024, it was the Holy Week, Semana Santa, which is a week before the Catholic Easter. Most people in Central America and in Latin America are Catholics, so they celebrate the Catholic religion and events quite a lot. And celebrations during March were basically happening all over the country. In the end, Easter is the biggest religious celebration for the Catholics. However, note that if you're going there, for instance, for the Holy Week, that will change, the dates will change every year as the Easter date changes every year. However, there are other events throughout the year, so if you want to visit during the specific event, plan accordingly. Preferably plan a bit ahead of time so you can get better hotels, better deals, everything else. When comparing Guatemala versus Costa Rica, it all comes down to the places that you want to visit. For instance, in Guatemala, I decided to rent a car and visit most of the popular spots in Guatemala, which include Antigua, Lake Atitlan, Chichicastenango, Semuc Champey, and Tikal. I have videos on my channel on all of those destinations, and you can take a look and see if they're worth it. If you're on a tight schedule, probably you should rent a car in Guatemala because that's the easiest way to see a lot of places and experience a lot of things in a short time frame. However, driving in Guatemala, for instance, is not for everybody, and you really need to carefully assess your driving experience before attempting to drive in Guatemala. I do recommend driving in Guatemala only if you are a very experienced driver with many years of experience driving in similar countries which are outside of the US or Europe. I have to mention that Guatemala is mostly preferred by backpackers and budget travelers who choose to use shuttles and public buses to get around the country. However, that will take you much longer to get from one point to another, and it's the better option if you really want to stay longer in Guatemala for the same budget. In Costa Rica, on the other hand, I skipped most of the tourist attractions because it seemed somehow similar to Guatemala. Now, this is one of the topics that sparkled some reaction on my previous video. And I stand by my opinion. I feel that from the start, I wanted to just relax in Costa Rica and not explore its natural parks and attractions because as an outsider, as a traveler, I did not see that much diversity from the things that I already saw in Guatemala, and I didn't want to spend more time, effort, and money visiting similar spots. However, that's just me, you do you. In Costa Rica, as I said, I skipped most of these attractions because, in my opinion, from what I read online and saw the pictures and everything, I decided that there were mostly similar spots to what I already saw in Guatemala, but they were all coming at a very premium price. A lot of foreigners decide to rent cars in Costa Rica, but the roads are not the best. I just want to mention that in Guatemala, the internet said that the roads are not great, but they were actually really good. I'm mentioning these details because many people seem to be afraid to drive in either of these countries, so that's why they basically rely on local tour agencies to get them places. But generally speaking, tour agencies are much more expensive in Costa Rica. Costa Rica's main export is tourism, accommodation options. In both Guatemala and Costa Rica, you will find a large range of accommodations throughout the country. From my personal experience, Guatemala has some really nice boutique hotels in most touristy areas such as Antigua or Lake Atitlan, and then has more traditional small guest houses and hotels in other parts of the country. Most of these hotels in Guatemala cater mostly to local or Spanish-speaking tourists and accommodate local expectations. So it may take a while for foreigners to understand that security is a very important topic in Central America in general, including Guatemala, and all accommodations will have closed gates, and some even have electrified wire on their wall. So very weird, strange sight at first, but you get used to it. At first I stayed around the airport in Guatemala City and then in a nice hotel in Antigua. I didn't find anything too weird about the accommodations, but then I stayed at a hotel with an armed guard and electrified wired, and it seemed empty, like we were the only guests there. That felt kind of weird. Then we stayed at other small hotels and guest houses, and it seemed to me that Guatemala is maybe a great place for small groups and couples, but you will also find larger hotels if you need to. Costa Rica, on the other hand, has plenty of hotels everywhere you go, and there are a lot of the big international chain hotels present nearby the capital and the airport in San Jose. Many of these big hotels are right next to the airport, as many tourists arrive in Costa Rica, spend a night or two in San Jose, and then continue their trip around the country. Around all attractions in Costa Rica you will find boutique hotels that cater towards more wealthier tourists, but some budget options are still available. I would say it's easier to find and book a room in Costa Rica because most locals working in tourism speak English, and it will be much easier for you if you do not speak Spanish, as opposed to Guatemala, where only very popular spots or expensive hotels will have staff that can communicate in English. However, the prices for English-speaking experiences are much higher. It's obvious that Costa Rica caters towards wealthier hotels because you will find some 5-star all-inclusive resorts there, which are not a common sight in Guatemala. So this leads us to the cost of travel. Guatemala is the budget version of Costa Rica for sure. While some places in Guatemala, like hotels and some touristy attractions, accept international bank cards for payments, it's always a good idea to have cash with you. In Guatemala, you will not need a lot because you can easily find ATMs in cities, but I do recommend carrying around the equivalent of $50 or so in cash with you at all times. You can aim to pay with a card whenever that's possible and save the cash that you have for when there is no other option for paying. Most tourist attractions in Guatemala are more expensive for foreigners than they are for locals, but that's the case in most countries. Let's just talk about some average prices to expect when traveling in Guatemala. Do note that these prices were just from my own personal experience, and I travel in Guatemala in March 2024, so maybe these prices are not accurate anymore by the time you see this video or travel to Guatemala. So some average prices from my experience: $5 to $10 the entrance ticket for attractions in Guatemala, $25 to $50 medium range hotel for 2 people, $5 to $10 random cafes for snacks, $15 the meal for 2 in a nice restaurant outside touristy area, $30 the meal for 2 people in touristy areas, so double. Car rental for a week, $400, depends on the model of the car, and $350 the deposit. Please only use these prices to give you an idea about the cost of travel in Guatemala, but don't actually make a travel plan based on these prices because they can always fluctuate. Also, if you are not planning your trip by yourself in Guatemala and plan on driving, you might end up in highly touristy places, which are obviously more expensive than the average locations in Guatemala. Now, let's talk about Costa Rica. As soon as I landed in San Jose, I was shocked to see that everything was more expensive than Guatemala. Average prices to expect when traveling in Costa Rica, and specifically in San Jose: $20 to $30 entrance ticket for an attraction, $50 to $100 medium range hotel room for 2, $40 meal for 2 in highly touristy area, but it could be more. And car rental for a week, $500 plus deposit. If you decide to visit Guatemala, then you should expect to spend around $50 per person per day. Depends on the activities that you have planned, but if you plan on traveling on a budget, you could probably spend less in a day. However, in Costa Rica, you will spend much more because this is, as they call it, the Switzerland of Central America. So most nature experience will cost you money. I would say plan to spend at least $150 per day per person if you're traveling to Costa Rica. Activities and attractions. Since we already talked about money, let's talk about how you're gonna spend it in these countries. Well, Guatemala, in my opinion, offers a lot of diversity in its attractions. Think about Spanish colonial towns, volcano tracking, active volcanoes, hidden natural pools, and the center of the Mayan civilization. What sets Guatemala apart from all of the other countries in Central America are the Mayan ruins, which are extraordinary, and I'm surprised they did not make it on the list of world wonders. Now, the Mayan ruins can also be found on today's territory of Belize, but there's a whole nother topic about Belize and Guatemala. Costa Rica unfortunately does not have much left of its Arboretum heritage, and its main attractions revolve around natural spots such as volcanoes, rainforests, tropical beaches, and waterfalls. When Costa Rica was conquered, the conquistadors eventually decimated the local population, and the sad history of the locals cannot be seen much except for their national museum in San Jose, the capital of Costa Rica. But Costa Rica puts a lot of effort into marketing and advertises itself as a place with 6% of all biodiversity on Earth. This means that all national parks have a high ticket entrance fee, and all tours are expensive for the average tourist. Because I have visited the most popular spots in Guatemala just before I arrived in Costa Rica, I decided to skip the top attractions in Costa Rica. The main reason were the prices and the superior attitude of the locals towards foreigners. It seemed to me that Costa Rica's main industry is tourism, and it's all about doing business and getting your money. While I do understand that, and I do spend a lot of money when I'm traveling, I couldn't justify to spend hundreds of dollars on a day trip to a beach or to see a volcano after witnessing similar raw nature in Guatemala. I got a bit of hate, as I said on my last YouTube video about Costa Rica when talking about this issue, but I felt the need to mention it here once more because there are not a lot of videos out there commenting on these huge differences in price levels between the two countries. Food and drink. Both Guatemala and Costa Rica are heavily influenced by American food chains and markets. However, Guatemala still preserves a lot of its authentic restaurants and meals, while Costa Rica caters towards American tourists mostly, and most of its restaurants offer meals like pizza and fries, which are kind of exotic for Guatemala. It's not to say that you're not gonna be able to find international foods in either of these countries, but the chances of you randomly stopping and finding a local cafe in Guatemala are much higher than they are in Costa Rica. Just with any cultural sites, Guatemala wins the battle of food and drinks, offering a plethora of local options wherever you go. Meanwhile, Costa Rica offers an international vibe and food and drinks options, which is probably what most of their tourists are looking for. Luckily, if you want to eat local produce, you can do so in each of these countries. In Guatemala, I mostly ate at local restaurants, which was great, by the way. And in Costa Rica, since I only stayed in San Jose, I cooked my own food with fresh produce from the local supermarket and markets where all the locals would shop. At the beginning, it was kind of hard to know what was the local food in Costa Rica, but I picked food based on prices, and most of the times the traditional food is one of the most affordable options. Travel logistics. In both Guatemala and Costa Rica, renting a car is probably the best option if you want to experience and see the country by yourself. However, driving in Guatemala isn't for everybody, and I do not recommend it unless you're very experienced in driving in similar places and countries. In Guatemala, a lot of tourists, as I said, fall into the budget travel category, which means that they often choose to get around using either shuttles or public buses. The cheapest way to get around is using the local buses, the famous chicken buses in Guatemala, and these are more famous around the Antigua region, that part of the country. In Costa Rica, on the other hand, most tourists tend to opt for private tours, or they can also travel around in buses or rent a car or rent a scooter, whatever. However, the local public buses run by the government have a rather complicated schedule, which we could not figure it out, and apparently it was our fault we couldn't figure it out because nobody would help. And then the only option was to book a tour or a shuttle from a private tour or travel agency. Cultural insights. Well, if culture is what you were looking for, then the obvious choice is Guatemala. You have different cities in Guatemala, such as Antigua, Chichicastenango, or even Flores, which is near Tikal, with all different vibes and culture, which offer a lot for you to discover and experience. Costa Rica, unfortunately, as I said, lost all its cultural heritage. If you're interested in learning more about Costa Rica's heritage, then you should probably not miss the National Museum located in San Jose. Beyond that, Costa Rica acts as a tropical resort for rich Americans looking for their next international meal. It's not bad, it's just different. Even more, Costa Rica doesn't have many indigenous people left according to their museum. Most of them have perished after the colonization. The locals you will find today in Costa Rica are descendants, mostly from what I presume, of those European conquistadors and today's expats. While Guatemala has many different cultural etiquettes, which change from region to region, Costa Rica doesn't seem to have any. Conclusion: it's very hard to compare Guatemala and Costa Rica. And why is that? Because these countries offer a different experience and cater towards different types of tourists and travelers. I would recommend Guatemala to anyone who is interested in observing the local culture of Central America, who wants to observe the day-to-day lives of locals and descendants of the Mayan civilization. It's a country of extremes where American fast food chains have made it, but there are also cities that follow very old traditions and mix the religious rituals of the Spaniards with their own. On the other hand, I would recommend Costa Rica if the only thing you're interested in is having the picture-perfect holiday that you can post on your social media. I also recommend Costa Rica only if your travel budget is not a concern. Thank you for watching my video. If you have any advice, tips, or questions, I expect them in my comments.